I was folding laundry on a Tuesday afternoon when my mother-in-law walked into the room without knocking and told me I had 30 days to get out of her son's house. She didn't phrase it like a question. She didn't phrase it like a request. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like she'd just come from reviewing a document, which, knowing her, she probably had. She said my husband and I were separating, that the house belonged to the family, that I had no business being there without Donovan, and that 30 days was more than generous. I set down the shirt I was folding. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said very calmly, "Which house are you referring to exactly?" She blinked just once. Then she said, "This one, the one you're standing in." I nodded slowly like I was considering this information for the first time. "Okay," I said, "I'll keep that in mind." She left, and I went back to folding laundry. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, not Donovan, not his sister, not the family attorney they'd had on retainer for 22 years, was that the house she was standing in, the house with the wraparound porch and the detached garage and the half-acre lot backing up to the creek, had been mine for 14 months. Let me back up, because nothing about that Tuesday makes sense without everything that came before it. My name is Adrienne. I'm 34 years old. I spent 6 years married to a man whose family treated me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome from the moment I said I do. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least I try not to. Bitterness is expensive, and I spent most of my 20s already bankrupt in ways that didn't show up on a credit report. Donovan and I met when I was 26 and he was 30. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they've grown up with just enough money to be comfortable, and just enough attention to be dangerous. His family had built a regional landscaping company over 3 generations, the kind of business that gets a half-page feature in the local Chamber of Commerce newsletter every few years, the kind that makes people in a mid-sized Ohio city feel like they're somebody. They weren't wealthy by national standards. But in Crestwood Falls, the Hargrove name meant something, and they made sure you understood that within the first 10 minutes of meeting them. I came from nothing adjacent. My parents were teachers, we rented, we clipped coupons. We did not have a family attorney on retainer or a box at the minor league baseball stadium or strong feelings about which country club to join. When I started dating Donovan, his mother, Renata, I can use her name here, she's earned it, made it clear through a long sequence of small, precise cruelties that she considered me a category error. Not a bad person necessarily, just the wrong kind of person. The kind that didn't have the right last name, or the right zip code, or the right grandmother, to be brought into the Hargrove orbit permanently. She never said any of this directly. That's the thing about women like Renata. They don't need to be direct. They ask questions instead. Questions like, "And where did you say your family is from originally?" And I always wonder what it's like to grow up without certain advantages, and my personal favorite, delivered at Christmas dinner 2 years into the marriage. "Adrienne, you're so resourceful." It must come from having had to be. Donovan heard none of this, or he heard it and filed it under mom being mom, which is what he said anytime I brought it up, mom being mom. As if cruelty had a statute of limitations once you assigned it a personality trait. His sister Bethany was worse in some ways because she was closer to my age and should have known better. She'd done 4 years at Ohio State, had a master's in communications, ran the social media presence for the family business, and still managed to treat me with the particular condescension of someone who has been told their whole life that their family is special and has never been given a reason to question it. She borrowed things without asking. She made plans with Donovan that included the whole family and forgot to tell me until the morning of. She called me Addie when she knew I hated it, and then laughed when I corrected her, like the correction was the problem. For 6 years I held my tongue and kept my grace and told myself that I had chosen this family and so I would make it work. I told myself that Donovan's good qualities outweighed the rest, and there were good qualities. He was funny when he wasn't performing. He was generous and in ways that weren't about money. He coached his nephew's little league team every spring without being asked. He remembered the names of people who served him coffee and always left 20%. But a marriage is not a list of pros and cons that you tally on your better days. A marriage is what happens in the spaces between in the Tuesday afternoons when someone walks into your bedroom without knocking and tells you to get out. And in those spaces, what I found, more and more, was that I was alone. The separation started the way these things usually start, slowly and then all at once. There was no single catastrophic moment. There was just a long accumulation of smaller moments, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, until one morning I woke up and looked at the ceiling and thought, I am 33 years old, and I am tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and I think I have been for a long time. I told Donovan I wanted to separate in March. He was surprised, which surprised me, because I had thought I'd been clear for at least a year. We agreed to take time apart. He moved into his parents' house temporarily, which I knew wouldn't be temporary, because Renata had a way of making sure that anything involving her son defaulted back to her orbit eventually. What I did not tell Donovan, what I had not told anyone, was that 14 months earlier, I had quietly purchased the house we lived in. Here is how that happened. Donovan and I had rented the house on Alderton Road for 3 years. It was a rental from an older couple, the Prestons, who'd moved to Florida and didn't want to deal with the property long distance anymore. We had a good relationship with them. I paid rent on time. I handled minor repairs without bothering them. I planted flowers along the front walk that their daughter thanked me for the following spring. About 2 years into our tenancy, Mr. Preston called me, not Donovan, me, because I was the one who handled the logistics, and told me they were thinking of selling. He wanted to give us first right of refusal before they listed it. The price he quoted was below market. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. He said it was because we'd been good tenants, and he didn't want to deal with showings if he didn't have to. I did not tell Donovan. I want to explain that decision because I know how it sounds. I was in finance. I had spent 8 years as a financial analyst and had recently moved into a senior role at a regional investment firm. I understood mortgages. I understood how to read a property valuation. I understood, more importantly, that this house in this neighborhood had been appreciating at roughly 6% annually, and that below market was not a small thing. I also understood something else, which was harder to quantify, but just as real. I had been making financial decisions in this marriage for 6 years, quietly and without acknowledgement, the same way I had been making all the other decisions. The insurance policies. The retirement contributions that Donovan kept meaning to set up and never did. The emergency fund that existed entirely because of my discipline. All of it invisible, all of it mine, all of it assumed as background. And I thought, this one thing I will do for me. I used savings I had built before the marriage. I used a financial structure my attorney helped me set up that was entirely legal and entirely mine. I took out a mortgage in my name alone, which I qualified for on my income alone, which I had been building alone. I closed on the house on a Thursday in October. I told Mr. Preston I appreciated his discretion. He seemed to understand something without my having to explain it, the way older people sometimes do. I paid the mortgage from my personal account. I kept paying what had been the rent from our joint account to myself as a reimbursement. Donovan never looked at statements closely. He earned a good salary from the family business and spent it easily and assumed that things were fine because they always had been. Because I had made them fine. I want to be clear about something here. What I did was legal. I have documentation for every part of it. I told my attorney everything, and she reviewed everything, and there was nothing in our marriage that prevented me from purchasing property in my own name. Ohio is not a community property state. We had kept our finances partially separate from the beginning, a decision Renata had actually pushed for when we got married, because she didn't want outside money, complicating the family business, which I found deeply ironic in retrospect. So when Renata came to the door on that Tuesday afternoon and told me I had 30 days to vacate her son's house, she was wrong on every factual level. Her son's house. Her son had never owned this house. Her son had never seen the deed. The only name on that deed was mine. The call came at 6:45 the next morning. I was already up. I'm always up early. It's one of the habits I built in the years when I had to be efficient with my time, because no one was going to be efficient on my behalf. I was on my second cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table, watching the light come through the window over the sink when my phone rang. It was Donovan. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Something tight and confused, the voice of a man who has just found out that the map he's been using is wrong. He said his mother had called the family attorney. He said the attorney had pulled county property records. He said they were looking at something they didn't understand. Adrienne, he said, what did you do? I set down my coffee cup carefully. I bought a house, I said. This house, yes. The silence was long enough that I heard him exhale twice. When? 14 months ago. Another silence. And you didn't tell me? No, I said. I didn't. I could hear him working through it, the way he worked through things, slowly and visually, like he needed to build a picture before he could respond to it. Why? He finally asked. I thought about that for a moment. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the real one. Because I had spent 6 years taking care of things that no one noticed, I said. And I wanted one thing that was mine without having to justify it. He didn't have an immediate response to that. I had noticed, over the years, that the moments when Donovan went quiet were usually the moments when something true had gotten through. Renata called 40 minutes later. If Donovan's voice had been confused, hers was something else entirely. She had moved straight through confusion and arrived at a place I can only describe as controlled fury, the kind that comes from a person who has spent decades being the final authority on everything in her immediate world and has just encountered something outside her jurisdiction. She called what I'd done deceptive. She called it manipulative. She said I had taken advantage of a situation to undermine the family. I let her finish. I had learned in 6 years exactly how long her storms lasted. I bought a house that was on the market, I said when she paused. I used my own money. I have documentation for everything. There is nothing deceptive about any of it. You hid it from my son. I made a financial decision in my own name with my own funds. Donovan's has his own accounts that I don't have visibility into. This isn't different. It is completely different, and you know it. Renata, I said, what would you like to happen here? She didn't answer right away. That was new. In 6 years, Renata had always had an immediate answer. What happened in the week that followed was its own kind of education. Renata called her attorney, who called my attorney, who reviewed everything and confirmed what I already knew. The purchase was clean, the title was clear, and there was no legal mechanism by which the house could be claimed by anyone other than me. Ohio law was not ambiguous on this point. The attorney, according to my attorney, had used the phrase entirely above board 3 times in one paragraph, which I took as a good sign. Bethany texted me. This surprised me, because Bethany rarely communicated with me directly when there was a family position she could communicate through instead. She said she felt I had been dishonest with her brother and that the family was processing what I'd done. She also said that she hoped I understood the position this put everyone in. I read the text twice. Then I wrote back, I understand the position completely. I hope everyone does too. She didn't respond. Donovan came to the house on the 4th day. He rang the doorbell, which he had never done in 3 years of living there, and the formality of that small gesture told me something about where he was in his own processing. I opened the door and let him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Renata had delivered her 30-day notice, and I made coffee because that's what I do when I need my hands to have something to do. He said he wasn't angry. I believed him, mostly. Donovan's anger had never been explosive. It was more like a slow leak, something that seeped out in silence and distance rather than confrontation. What he seemed to be, more than angry, was recalibrating. Like a man who'd just been shown that the room he was standing in was bigger than he'd measured. I didn't know you had that kind of savings, he said. I know. I didn't know you'd been thinking about buying. I know that too. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. Did you know, when you bought it, that we were going to separate? I thought about this honestly. I knew something was wrong, I said. I didn't know what form it was going to take. He nodded. That's fair, he said, and I appreciated that he said it, because it was fair. What I told him next was the part I had been thinking about for a long time. Not the legal part, not the financial part, but the reason, underneath the reason. I told him that I had spent 6 years feeling like a visitor in spaces that I had poured myself into. That every contribution I made, financial or logistical or emotional, had been absorbed and unremarked upon, the way water gets absorbed by ground that takes it for granted. That his mother had walked through my bedroom door without knocking and told me to leave what she called her son's house, and that the only thing I felt in that moment, truly felt, was how completely unsurprised I was. He listened. He didn't defend his mother, which told me something. He didn't defend himself either, which told me more. I'm not asking you to go anywhere, I said. This house is not a weapon. I'm not going to evict you or use this as leverage. That's not why I'm telling you. Then why? Because I want you to know what it felt like, I said. To have done everything right and still feel like none of it counted. He was quiet for a while. Outside the window I could hear the creek running. We'd had a lot of rain that spring and the water was high. It counted, he said finally. I just didn't say so enough. That was the truest thing he'd said to me in a long time. A few days after that conversation, I called Renata. Not because she deserved a call, but because I was not going to let this situation harden into something we'd both carry for years without having actually spoken. She answered on the second ring. She sounded prepared, like she'd been expecting this and had decided how she was going to handle it. I told her that I wasn't calling to argue and that I wasn't calling to negotiate because there was nothing to negotiate. I told her that I was calling because I wanted to say one thing clearly. I have been in this family for 6 years, I said. I have contributed to it financially, practically, and in ways that no one ever saw or asked about. I did not ask to be thanked. I did not ask for anything except to be treated like I belonged here. Instead, you walked into my bedroom and told me I had 30 days to get out of your son's house. A house you didn't know I owned because you never looked. You assumed. You have always assumed. Silence. Long enough that I checked the call. The house is mine, I said. Not because of the separation. Not to punish anyone. It was mine before any of this happened. And how you treat people should not depend on whether or not they own the house you're standing in. She said nothing for a long moment. And then, in a voice that was smaller than any voice I'd heard from her in 6 years, she said, I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. That's exactly the point. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, as these things go when neither party is actually fighting over property, because the property was already settled. My attorney handled everything. Donovan was decent throughout, which I had expected. He had always been decent in the ways that were easy to be decent. The ways that were harder were the ones he was still working on, and I didn't think that was something I could wait around for. Renata did not apologize. I want to be accurate about this, because I think the expectation of a clean-spoken apology is something that movies have a lot to answer for. What she did was show up at the house 3 weeks later, unannounced, which normally would have been exactly the problem. But this time she knocked. She stood on the porch and she knocked and she waited. I opened the door. She had a plant with her, a hosta in a clay pot, which I found oddly specific. She held it out and said she knew I'd been working on the shaded side of the yard and she thought it might do well there. I looked at the plant. I looked at her. She was not a woman who explained herself, and she did not explain herself now. I took the plant. Come in, I said. I just made coffee. She came in. We sat at the kitchen table. We did not talk about the house or the deed or the 30 days. We talked about the hosta, which apparently spreads if you give it enough time, and about the creek, which she said used to flood when Donovan was small, and about a few other things that had nothing and everything to do with what had happened between us. She left after 45 minutes. She did not call me Addie once. Bethany took longer. Bethany sent a formal text 2 months later that said she appreciated my perspective and hoped we could have a fresh start, which was the most communications degree thing I'd ever read, and I told her so. And she actually laughed, which surprised us both. We are not close. I do not expect that we will be. But we are no longer performing hostility, and that feels like something. The divorce was finalized in November. I signed the papers on a Friday morning and went back to the house and walked through every room the way you walk through a space when you are trying to understand it again after a long absence. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway, with the spot where the baseboard heater made a ticking sound in cold weather. My home office with the window that looked out onto the backyard. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I thought about 6 years of being the person who made things work quietly, without acknowledgement, without credit. I thought about Renata at the door. I thought about the plant on the porch, which I had repotted and put under the oak tree, where it was already starting to spread. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I let it cool just a little, because I have never understood people who drink coffee when it's scalding, and I looked out at the yard, which was mine, in a neighborhood I had chosen, in a house I had paid for, on a piece of ground that had my name on the deed and no one else's. I was not triumphant. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect a certain kind of ending from a story like this. The fist in the air, the soundtrack swelling, the sense of having won something enormous. That's not what it felt like. What it felt like was quieter than that and more durable. It felt like the particular relief of a woman who has spent years trying to prove she belongs somewhere, and has finally simply stopped needing to prove it. The hosta came back the following spring. Bigger than before, just like she said it would. I left it exactly where it was.